Welcome to Boston Jewish Now, a podcast of the JCRC of Greater Boston. We are recording on June 3rd, 2026, with a very special guest, Rachel Schlesinger, the marketing coordinator here at JCRC. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Yeah, it's great to be here. Very interesting being in front of the camera instead of behind it.
Yeah, for our regular viewers and listeners, Rachel's usually sitting right over there on the other side of the room, managing the tech. So she's doing a little bit of double duty today. But it is Pride Month, and we were having a conversation the other day in the office, which sort of, as we were going about it, turned into a bit of an intergenerational conversation about being out and part of the LGBTQ community and working in the Jewish community, which both of us are. And we were realizing as we were having this conversation, it's like, well, why not have a conversation on the podcast and invite the community into it to hear the conversation we wanted having, because we thought it was interesting. So we hope you do too. So let's kick it off as we celebrate Pride Month and talk about some of the things that are going on in terms of JCRC, what it means to be a Jewish professional who's out and what that means in this day and age, and some of the things that are going on in terms of safety, belonging, and some of the challenges that are come up in terms of being out in Jewish space as an LGBTQ member of the community, or out in LGBTQ spaces as a Jewish member of that space. So, Rachel, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So, as previously mentioned, I am out. I've been out for at least a decade now. And my identity, I think, is more so on being queer rather than being Jewish more upfront. But of course, within the past couple of years, especially in a post-October 7th world, it has become more of a forefront in my mind.
I'm cognizant, and I giggled a little bit when you talked about being out for over a decade, and I'm saying like, and 15 years ago I came here, so I'm like a little bit of a, let's talk about how times have changed, because so I'm saying this in the sense of like, I came here mid-career and it was a thing that there was an out director of a JCRC, not a bad thing, but it was like this is a moment, a marker. That was not the place the Jewish communal professional world was when I started. And you are talking about like, you came out 10 years ago. And obviously, by the time you came out, not only JCRC, but many Jewish organizations around the country had embraced LGBTQ equality. There were, at that point, certainly 10 years ago, many, not enough, but many out LGBTQ Jewish leaders holding leadership roles in Jewish organizations. So let's back up a little bit maybe and just talk about, like, for you, what are your own early experiences with thinking about that navigation of being both Jewish and out and coming into, and what was it like for you coming into a Jewish professional space?
Marriage equality has kind of been a thing for all of my adult life, especially because I was a part of the Gay Straight Alliance in my high school. I knew that coming into this work and being out and being who I am, it wouldn't necessarily be too much of a problem. Things have definitely shifted in my mind because I'm so used to be in queer spaces versus Jewish spaces, but now that narrative has flipped. In a post-October 7th world, I'm entering these spaces with the understanding that I may not be allowed to be more outwardly Jewish without facing stigma with that. So it is a positive that I could be queer and who I am in that capacity, but I can't always necessarily be my true self in places where being who you are and being like, this is the space where you're supposed to belong and be with community. I can't always be my true self in those spaces because of the possible repercussions.
You raised something that's, I think, very much on the mind of a lot of Jewish and queer members of our community, which is the navigation of belonging in both spaces. Mm-hmm. And this isn't a new thing. It's certainly become a more visible and discussed challenge in the last couple of years. And I'm mindful, I was telling you a story the other day, and this goes back even before my time here, where there was an Israeli gay men celebration event happening at a New York LGBTQ center. This is like maybe 18, 20 years ago. And that center, even though the sponsor of the event was a very prominent figure in the New York gay community, that center experienced a call to boycott the event and prevent them from having this celebration of gay Israeli culture in the building. And I remember at the time, this is before I was working in the JCRC, that I and a friend of mine who was, I don't know if he was then or he went on to become the first out chair of the board of Washington, D.C.'s Jewish Federation, had to really get on the phone with the New York JCRC director at the time, who was a mentor of mine, to really help him understand what this celebration of Israeli gay culture was about, and to help him understand, or like have the toolkit to engage this question and not just ignore it as an internal thing within the gay community in New York. And just to clarify for our audience without getting into specific, it had a lot to do with sexuality and public expressions of sexuality in the Israeli community. And I think there were people at that time in the mainstream organized Jewish community in New York who were frankly a little uncomfortable with getting into it. And so like we've been seeing these questions, and that was a moment in my life at an earlier point in my career as a Jewish professional, I could see this navigation into communities I was in that was messy. And obviously since then we've had issues where I think the Jewish community has paid more attention to this issue after like the Dyke March in Chicago several years back. And, several years ago, a wider bridge, which no longer exists as of this spring, and others really thought it was important to create an LGBTQ Jewish pride flag, which we have, in our coasters today, and is actually on the flag that's hanging outside this CJP building for Pride Month, that there were members of the Jewish LGBTQ community who were increasingly wanting to be seen in their queer spaces explicitly as Jewish, and Jewish with a commitment to their attachment to Israel as a Jewish place. And I know that's different. That's different from the things we were talking about 20 or 30 years ago. And, you talked about your experience in a GSA in high school. I mean, the norms around being queer in high school for you are very different from they were 10 or 20 years before you. And I'm wondering a little bit about how you think about when those moments of tension show up in your personal space, queer space, like when those moments of tension show up about essentially being out as Jewish or being out as working in a mainstream Jewish context, or what you do, how you think about it.
I am very comfortable with screaming from the rooftops, like who I love, who I want to love, etc. The issue that I've been finding, especially with connecting with people of my generation, is coming out of the closet of what I do for work, how I align myself politically, and how connected I feel to the Jewish community and the Jewish community's support for Israel. So that has been a constant problem that I have been seeing, especially in my journey, as both holding both of these narratives. There are a lot of occasions where I won't necessarily talk about it just because I don't want to either have that conversation or that I don't feel comfortable expressing my cultural identity with these people who I would normally see as my go-to peers about these, because they're also in these queer spaces with me. It's harder for me to come out as Zionist than it is as queer. It probably wasn't that way like 10, 15, some odd years ago.
What the LGBT community, or certainly what the Pride movement has been about, which is being authentic in your full self in every space. And that's when I think about what Pride Month is celebrating, it is about living our truth and our authenticity. And if our authenticity includes commitments to our Jewish people, and commitments to our Jewish people, including having a homeland, then that should be part of what is welcome in our queer communities, because it's part of our authenticity in the same way so many other authentic identities and selves are part of what we bring into those spaces. And so for me, like my own journey, has been about navigating this question of authenticity and truth in a different way. Certainly growing up as an Orthodox yeshiva student in New York in the 70s and 80s, we did not have any GSAs in our high school. And although there were certain things that definitely growing awareness in terms of, I think, things that were unspoken and things that were not known in a pre-internet era, information that was not out there and easily accessible. And at the same time, growing up in New York in the 80s, there were clearly people who were LGBT or maybe at least LG visibly in our day-to-day life, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. That was, Pride was already present in New York, and obviously the AIDS crisis, which was both the darkest time in LGBTQ history, or amongst the darkest times, and at the same time, a moment that forced visibility, because a lot of people who weren't out were suddenly, by necessity, out. So conscious of both those communities, and conscious sometimes of switching back and forth quietly between sometimes being in the gay community in New York in the 80s and 90s, and sometimes being in the Jewish community. And at the same time, some interesting moments of, in the first several years of my professional career, not being out at work, although out to a growing number of personal friends, including some who I worked with. And so there were interesting moments, and I'm just like, one of them I was thinking about, like working for the mayor. I don't remember if it was 1992 or 1993, but I think it was 93, when New York Salute to Israel parade did not allow the LGBTQ synagogue, Congregation Besimchat Torah, to march in the parade. And specifically, at that time, the parade was very much for youth groups, school groups. It was about kids and youth and school groups. And CBST at that time, what they were asking for is to have their Hebrew school march, as other Hebrew schools did. And they weren't allowed to march. And I was working for the mayor, and we, because he was very much a liberal Zionist, this is David Dinkins, and side note, we can talk about mayors of New York and the tradition of Zionist mayors of New York from other communities. And that might be a whole podcast in and of itself, but he wanted to make sure he marched in the Salute to Israel parade, as every mayor has up until about 2 days ago. Mm-hmm. And he also wanted to show his commitment to the LGBTQ Jewish community. And there ended up being a post-parade LGBTQ Jewish Salute to Israel rally at a synagogue sort of near the end of the parade line. And so we went from the parade to this queer Jewish rally for Israel. And so it was a very different time about where the navigation was. And there I was staffing the mayor at a queer event as his Jewish aide, but not out of the closet. So like it was a very different time in my life. And had to navigate a certain amount of it was totally normal in those spaces as I was coming up where I wasn't quite out of the closet fully. Although I guess I was more out of closet than I realized, because when I did come out of the closet, people were like, it's about time. But it was more normative to be Zionist in liberal gay spaces in New York than it was to be out queer families in Jewish space. And that was the world that I was working in at the beginning of my career. And that is the world in which I ended up coming out professionally in my Jewish spaces.
There is just a huge resistance, especially in people around my age and of my generation, that everything is very much cut and dry. And that if you're not with us, you're against us. If you align yourself in a certain way, especially when it comes to Israel, oh, you probably want to take away my rights. And that's not at all what's going on. But that is the conversations that are being had in these spaces of people around my age and within the cultural zeitgeist, especially on the internet. And it is really a shame because, I want to celebrate who I am. I want to be proud of who I am. I'm going to Pride this weekend. But I know that when I enter into this, especially when I'm marching with Keshet, the
Yep.
queer Jewish organization, of course.
Love them. Was on the founding board, the national.
Yeah. But I know that there is going to be some backlash from the people around us, especially depending on what flags we use. If there's a Star of David, there's going to be people screaming at us, probably around the parade.
Some of what you're describing is not unique to millennial and Gen Z LGBTQ communities. It is a larger challenge in our moment in the millennial and Gen Z communities, this sort of groupthink, with us on everything, or you're the enemy mentality. And we've talked about this here before. So I don't want us to come across as being it's a specific problem of the queer left when it's a much larger problem of the left. This sort of lumping in and just binary approach to Israel-Palestine. Yeah. And at the same time, I know I experienced this, a frustration with certain parts of the queer left that they go to this binary on Israel-Palestine based on one factor or another and are just completely unwilling to engage the possibility that there are more factors in the international world that queer politics should inform. Like, for example, countries where queer people are repressed, oppressed, and frankly executed. I think there's something to be said for this larger critique that you are generationally navigating in certain millennial spaces. And then there's a more specific critique around a certain queer politics that doesn't put front and center solidarity with queer communities in other countries in the way, frankly, that it did 5 or 10 years ago. And it's a little surprising to me when in certain, not all, but in certain queer communities, the commitment to LGBTQ liberation around the world is far less important than other politics.
Speaking on this topic, a couple years ago, you and the JCRC director of San Francisco wrote an op-ed specifically addressing this issue. It is a shame that things haven't changed all that much in the last 2 years, but do you feel like it's gotten worse, or do you feel like it's stayed the same? How have we progressed as a community to begin making Zionist queers more welcome?
I don't want to say without evidence whether something has gotten worse or better in a period of time. And yeah, Ty Gregory, who before he went to the San Francisco JCRC was the executive director of A Wider Bridge, which was working on building bridges between the LGBTQ community in the United States and in Israel. He and I wrote this op-ed after October 7th, so it hasn't been that long ago. I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think in an entirely unscientific way, as I experience it, and my experience comes with a lot of blinders on it, and I'll own that. I don't know that it has gotten worse in the 2 years since we wrote that op-ed in terms of Jewish experiences in queer spaces. I definitely think it has gotten far more problematic in terms of Jewish and Zionist experiences in progressive spaces. And I think it's fairly self-evident that over the last 2 years since we wrote that op-ed, the normalization of anti-Semitic rhetoric certainly in progressive left political spaces and the rapid devolution of certain discourse around American politics to conspiracy theories about Jews or Jews and Israel in progressive spaces has clearly gotten worse over the last 2 years, at the same time as it's gotten much worse on the right as well. So like we are experiencing a moment where amidst hyperpolarization in our society, the groupthink and polarization and conspiracy thinking that rapidly devolves into anti-Semitic or at least hostile to Israel, and then I am holding out a little bit of a distinction in this conversation, has gotten worse in the last 2 years on both sides since we wrote that op-ed. But I can't say specifically that it's gotten worse amongst the left in the LGBTQ community. And it's possible even that in some ways, what was going on, as I mentioned, even 20 years ago in certain LGBTQ spaces may have been the canary in the coal mine for what was coming in more spaces in the years since. And it also hasn't necessarily been awful in every space. And that's why I say I have my own blinders. I don't typically engage with the hardcore left spaces. I'm very much, to the extent I'm in LGBTQ spaces, it's often in sort of like more liberal mainstream spaces where the conversation is more like, I am frustrated with what Israel's doing, or I'm struggling with, or I have a problem with the prime minister. And I'm like, you and me both. I want to name that you've been doing a bunch of work with some of your friends here in Boston in creating LGBTQ Jewish space. And I know that you have been doing a lot of program planning together with CJP, which launched an LGBTQ young adult initiative. What was it, about 2 years ago? And I think that needs to be named, and I think that needs to be celebrated. And on the one hand, if you had told me when I was a young adult in this community in the 1990s or early aughts, although not in Boston, but in New York, that federations would be creating LGBTQ affinity groups for young adults as a normative activity, I would have been thrilled. I mean, that's amazing. And part of Keshet's thesis for why we took it national 20 some years ago, a little over that, and what we were trying to do is for the full welcoming participation and belonging of LGBTQ Jews in Jewish space. Keshet was not, while it has definitely worked on and continues to work on larger issues like civil marriage equality, trans rights in America, etc., the starting premise and most of its work has been about belonging in Jewish space. So to the extent that young queer Jews are feeling like they don't have a place to gather in their full belonging, and Jewish communities are creating those spaces or supporting them in creating those spaces in Jewish community, that's fantastic. And that is something that is just like, it should be celebrated and welcomed. And I am thrilled to see it. And part of me really hopes that young people coming up today are seeing and experiencing Jewish community in a way that is different from the way I experienced Jewish community sometimes when I was seeing a Jewish community that wasn't terribly welcoming of its gay and lesbian families back in the 90s. On the other hand, I think there are two issues here, one of which is I don't think it's a healthy thing that a community whose core commitment, and I'm talking about the LGBT community as I experience it and embrace it, if its core commitment is about belonging in one's fullness and belonging with authenticity and without judgment. And I think the without judgment is a key part of that. And to go to a pride parade, look, I'll say it, I go to a pride celebration and there are people celebrating in ways that don't make me personally like fulfilled or are not my thing, whatever my thing is, and I'm not going to get into it. But like, you do you and I do I. And like that is what pride celebrations are about, is you do you, I'm going to do me, and we're here because of what we're celebrating. And if that is you do you except for, then that's not authentic to what pride to me is about. And then I think there's a larger question. I think it's a larger question beyond pride, beyond the queer community that Jews have to ask, which is, at least for Jews in America, the extent to which we are going to withdraw from spaces. And if we are absent from space, what that means. We had a podcast here just a few weeks ago with the president of a Catholic university who talked about how Jews can get a more authentic liberal education at Catholic universities than they could at certain Ivy League universities. And he may be right about that. I don't necessarily dispute that thesis. There is a cost to Jews withdrawing from those universities. There is a cost if Jews in America wholesale walk away from certain civic spaces, both in terms of, for us as a community, going back to a ghetto life, a shtetl life, where we do us by ourselves and we're not part of a broader civic society. And there's a cost to the broader civic society if we're not there. And frankly, other Jews who don't share our commitments to the Jewish people continue to be in those spaces. What do they perceive as normative Judaism? If all queer Jews who have a commitment to the importance of Israel as a Jewish homeland, not a commitment to support for the government of Israel, not a commitment to the support of the current government or any policies, but just to the existence of Israel as a Jewish homeland, start walking away from queer spaces, even for perfectly legitimate personal experience reasons, the only Jews that are going to be left in those spaces are going to be the Jews who are openly hostile to Jewish peoplehood and to Jewish commitments to Jewish peoplehood. And that's not good for us either. So it's a very complex question. And at the end of the day, I think on an individual basis, we all have to do what makes us feel safe. We all have to choose to go where we feel welcome. And we also have to work on building spaces where we feel safe and welcome. But we do have to look at the larger impact of that. Tell me a little more about why you decided to work in a Jewish space.
I grew up in an interfaith household, and I wasn't necessarily raised Jewish.
You thought of yourself as Jewish?
Yes. My mom was Christian and my dad was Jewish. I grew up celebrating both holidays. Also, my birthday is around Hanukkah, so it all just kind of got lumped up into one. But
you and me both.
Yeah.
Our birthdays are a day apart.
Yes. My mom was very big on especially with my upbringing, up until I was around, I want to say 10, entering middle school. She had me go to church for a number of years. And then especially when I became a teenager, my cousins on my dad's side were all around my age. So I started seeing what a bar and bat mitzvah was like. I felt like there was a huge disconnect, especially with being so close to my dad's side of the family from my faith. So as I continued on my journey into figuring out who I am, which is never ending, I started turning to my family and asking, where do we come from? What is our heritage? And my grandmother would tell me stories of how her mom came over from Russia in the 1900s and survived the pogroms. And I got very choked up, and then I watched Fiddler on the Roof, and then I cried because I was like, that's me, that's my family, which is very cheesy.
I'm just going to interject and say, my version of the Fiddler on the Roof thing is it's a very queer thing to have watched it as a kid.
That as well. But so as I got older, I wanted
show tunes.
Yes, I wanted to be more connected to that because I knew that it was a part of me. It was a part of my identity. Even my name sounds very Jewish. So I wanted to get more involved in that. I unfortunately have never been to Israel because every single time I tried to register for birthright, something catastrophic happens in the world.
Your generation has definitely dealt with the combination of COVID and a certain number of wars that made it hard to travel in the way that prior generations had to go to.
Even though Israel wasn't necessarily something at the forefront in my household and amongst my family, as the war started picking up in the mainstream and I started seeing all of these little Canva infographics spread throughout my Instagram stories about the conflict, I was like, what's going on here? And one of my peers from high school was the only one I saw posting things that were against the norm of the social justice warrior posting these things to their Instagram story. So that kind of made me want to look into the history a bit more. And I started reading more in depth into how the conflict started, how Israel became a country. And that kind of intertwined with my growth and understanding my cultural identity. When I got to grad school, I joined Hillel. I got very involved there by going to Shabbat every single month that they had it. And understanding that my grandmother also spent most of her life working in the Jewish community. And when she passed away, that really kind of was like, oh, I want to be a little bit more like her and make a difference in my community. I've always worked in nonprofit spaces in my adult life. And when this position came to be, I was like, this is perfect for me. And this is a great way for me to get more in touch with my Judaism as well. So it's been a journey for sure.
You mentioned the never-ending journey you're on about identity. And I think one of the things I've learned over the years is, in addition to who we are as a never-ending, ongoing evolution, being out or coming out is in its own way never-ending. I was already working professionally in the Jewish community by the time I came out at work, even though I was by and large out to most of my friends at that point in my late 20s. And this is like, we're talking late 90s. So it's a different time period and, it's a different era in the Jewish world. And some of my dearest and closest friends made the choice to really work on LGBTQ queer stuff, Jewishly specific. So like, to say example, work at Keshet or work at a wider bridge in its time, or work at one of the queer synagogues that were really coming into their own in a big way in the 80s and 90s and creating safe space for queer Jews. And I never went that path. I was certainly, served on some of those boards, was active in some of those organizations, but I definitely made the choice to work in mainstream or adjacent mainstream roles that were not about the queer Jewish community, but in which I would be consciously seen as a Jewish and queer professional, like working in a JCRC. That was a choice I made. And I sometimes told myself the story that one of the contributions I'm making to this is by being visible as a gay Jew working in like this space, in the advocacy space, in the Israel space, in the Jewish communal space. And that when I would go and speak to like Hillel groups, for example, here in Boston 10 or 15 years ago, I would always be very clear about being, I am an out Jew. Maybe I would specifically go during Pride Month or whatever, but I was coming to talk about broader issues. I was coming to talk about ways of thinking of ourselves as belonging within the rest of the institutional world. And this is not exclusive to Jewish space, but it is certainly true for many gays and lesbians. And as you said, it's interesting to hear you at the start of the podcast say that you present more as queer and that I probably present more as Jewish. Mm-hmm. I'll grant you that wearing a kippah every day is definitely a way of presenting as Jewish, but there are also spaces where, in this day and age with rising antisemitism, I freely admit that there are places when I'm by myself that I put a baseball cap on or something, because I don't necessarily want to be presenting as Jewish when I am in certain modes of public transportation by myself, mm-hmm. for example. And at the same time, there's a certain amount of like, how I present or don't present as queer can also change. I think some of my friends would laugh at the idea that I don't present as queer. And some of my friends would say, yeah, you definitely code switch depending on the day and depending on the work. So that I was surprised that a couple of years ago, this comes back to like JCRC's work. In 2022, when President Biden signed the Protection of Marriage Act at the White House. So I was invited to that. And it was an incredible honor to be invited to a bill signing at the White House. I'd never been invited to that, even though I'd been working in politics for a while. And it was meaningful for me because I remember being a campaign staffer in 1996 during the Clinton-Gore re-elect, which was right after President Clinton, that was defense of marriage. And President Clinton had definitely decided to lean in on some anti-gay rights themes to move to the center in his re-election. And it was something that I and others in the campaign, some of them were out, some of us who were doing outreach to the gay community and had to navigate that. Some of us who were not out, some of us who, people who knew I was gay, but I wasn't out at work. That was, early in my career, navigating the space of actively working for a Democratic president who was hostile to some of our rights. And to be invited many decades later to the White House for a bill signing meant a lot to me. And I thought I was being invited because JCRC had been working on this issue for over 2 decades. I thought this was like, I'm being invited because I'm JCRC. When I got there, it became clear, like there were several queer Jewish leaders who were there, including Edith from Keshet and Ty. But there weren't other Jewish leaders of organization that had supported gay rights. It was very much we were there as people the White House saw as LGBTQ activists who are Jewish or faith. And it was really wonderful. But one of the things that happened that day is I ended up missing one of our board meetings, JCRC board meetings, just the timing. And when I got the invitation, I reached out to our chair and I was like, I got this invitation to the White House, but it means missing a board meeting. And our chair was like, are you crazy? You're going to go to the White House. It's like, what an awesome opportunity. And it's something like we as an organization have been committed to for almost 2 decades. But you're going to miss the board meeting. And, they told the board, it's like, Jeremy's in the White House. This is an issue that JCRC has been committed to for a long time. And what an honor. And I come back and our team here told me, just so you know, a couple of people here in Boston, when they found out you were there, they were like, I didn't know Jeremy was gay. And I was like, okay, I've been here over a decade. I was on the founding board of Keshet nationally. I like to think of myself as presenting queer some places. Somebody missed the memo. And that's okay. What reminded for me is like coming out is not a one-time thing in professional space, whether it's coming out as gay, lesbian in the Jewish community or coming out as Jewish or Zionist in other spaces. Coming out is a lifelong journey and it's like a constant choice. And part of the reason I love doing a Pride podcast every year is like, in case anybody's paying attention, yes.
I mentioned before that I haven't seen a world in my adult life where gay marriage wasn't federally legalized. But we are shifting, especially in the federal space, about support towards LGBTQ people and trans rights and all things related to the umbrella of the queer community. How can we, in our civic spaces as the representative Jewish organization to our legislature, do to make not just the LGBTQ community feel safer, but also the Jewish community?
First of all, one of my proudest moments in my time at JCRC, because definitely I inherited in the sense of, coming into an organization that already had a legacy around civil marriage equality, was when we were navigating transgender public accommodations in Massachusetts. And JCRC was very committed to working with partners on transgender public accommodations in Massachusetts. And it was during the term of Governor Baker. And I remember standing off in the corner of a major pro-Israel event with Governor Baker in which we were discussing how to help navigate and reach a compromise on transgender public accommodations, specifically around the issue of a religious opt-out exception, so that religious communities who were not ready for that would not be forced someplace that they weren't ready to go on religious principles. And it was something that we were able to help the governor navigate so that we could reach the place where we had this major commitment to trans rights in Massachusetts that was then defended at the ballot with the support of a Republican governor. And that space, I think, as a Jewish organization that holds in part a faith identity, not entirely faith identity, also a people identity, and that's a whole other conversation, but also in part a commitment to civil rights. We have been able to advance important issues and important civil rights statements here in Massachusetts in a way that holds the whole of our community and in a way that respects the pluralism, both of our community and of Massachusetts. And so I think, and I've said this a couple of times, I've referenced this, I think the work going forward, our commitments, we cannot shy away from civil rights, not just civil rights for Jews, but for civil rights for all Americans. And we cannot shy away from a vision of a pluralistic democracy where everybody belongs and everybody is welcome in their authentic self. Because if we do, if we accept a world where America gives up on the pluralistic democratic project, where maybe you don't always get your way, maybe I don't always get my way, but we negotiate and we talk and we reach an accommodation and we reach an acceptable middle ground. If we give up on that, then maybe right now we as Jews are a welcome minority. And unfortunately, in parts of this country, for example, trans kids are not. And at another time in the future, it's possible that trans kids will be more accepted as a minority, but Jews are not. And we can't live in a world, I don't want either of those things. We can't live in a world where some minorities are safe and protected and others are not based on who's in power, or some minorities are welcome based on the ideology of those in positions of authority. We have to be a society in which all minorities are welcome and belonging. And the conversation we've had here, the conversation we've had recently in terms of how antisemitism is being fought by our state government has been a conversation about Jewish belonging. And that commitment to belonging has to be belonging for all people. And so in the same way that I often say that my Zionism commits me to the idea that the Jewish people have national rights to our own destiny in our own homeland, also informs my commitment to a Palestinian state, because the Palestinian people also have rights, national rights to pursuing their own destiny also in their homeland, which is shared. In the same way, I think part of us as JCRC and part of us as a Jewish community celebrating Pride this year, especially as we hit the 250th anniversary of the revolution and the Declaration of Independence, that our celebration of Pride is about reaffirming our commitment to authentic belonging for all Americans. And authentic belonging for us means not compromising on our Jewishness. And authentic belonging for trans kids and their families means not compromising on being trans, if that's what a person wants to be. And that is something we should embrace and hope that all Americans get to live authentically and fully and embraced by our society. And that's our hope for Pride. It's our hope for Jewish commitments to civil rights. And it's our hope for this 250th anniversary year of the United States.
Thank you so much.